Imagine this moment as it is recorded in 1 Samuel 17, not as legend, but as a military standoff with measurable facts. Two organized armies, the Israelites and the Philistines, camped on opposite slopes of the Valley of Elah around the early 11th century BCE. Separated by roughly half a mile of open ground, a tactical dead zone no soldier wanted to cross. Each morning and evening for 40 consecutive days, the Philistine champion, Goliath, a heavily armored infantryman, likely weighing over 300 pounds, including bronze helmet, coat of mail, greaves, javelin, spear, and shield bearer, stepped forward to issue a formal challenge of single combat, a known ancient Near Eastern war practice meant to decide battles without mass casualties. Yet Israel's forces, trained soldiers under King Saul, refused to respond, paralyzed not by lack of weapons, but by risk calculation. Because Goliath's height, described as 6 cubits and a span, placed him near 7 feet tall, statistically rare and psychologically destabilizing in pre-modern warfare. This daily ritual created a feedback loop of fear. Repeated exposure without response normalized inaction, eroded morale, and reframed retreat as survival, until the army's identity quietly shifted from defenders of a covenant nation to spectators of their own intimidation. Into this stalled system walked David, not as a volunteer, but as a logistics courier, sent by his father Jesse to deliver bread, roasted grain, and cheese to his older brothers. An operational detail that matters because it places David on the battlefield accidentally, not heroically, and confirms he had no military assignment, rank, or expectation of engagement. David's youth is emphasized not to inspire sentiment, but to clarify liability. Underage by combat standards, unarmored, and absent from Saul's chain of command, he possessed no formal authority to act. Yet he alone reacted differently to Goliath's speech, not because he was braver by temperament, but because he interpreted the threat through a different framework, one shaped before arrival. Where the army processed Goliath as a physical variable, height, armor weight, weapon range, David processed him as a theological violation, specifically the defiance of Israel's God, which shifted the cost-benefit analysis from survival to accountability. This distinction explains why David spoke while others remained silent, and why his first recorded action was not combat preparation, but inquiry, asking what reward would be given to the man who neutralized the threat, revealing that he saw the stalemate as solvable rather than inevitable. The contrast exposes the central mechanism often overlooked. The battlefield outcome was constrained not by Goliath's strength, but by Israel's collective assumption that prior credentials determine future victory, an assumption David did not share because his confidence did not originate in military hierarchy or visible qualification. By the time David stepped forward, the conflict had already been decided at the level of perception, one side measuring probability, the other measuring faithfulness. And the shepherd's arrival did not introduce courage into the scene. It revealed how long fear had already been in control, which is why the decisive moment did not begin with a sling, but with the collapse of a false consensus that said giants dictate outcomes.
Before David appears in any public record as a warrior, he exists in a context that ancient sources consistently treat as low-status labor: pastoral shepherding in the Judean highlands, a semi-arid region where flocks required constant movement to find grazing, exposing shepherds to isolation, weather extremes, and predatory wildlife, conditions documented across Iron Age Levantine agriculture. David is introduced in 1 Samuel 16 as the youngest son of Jesse, excluded from a ceremonial inspection for kingship precisely because his role was considered functionally irrelevant, a detail that establishes both his marginal position within his own household and the absence of social leverage. Shepherding in this period was not passive observation. It involved daily route planning, water source memorization, night watches, and active defense, with failure resulting in financial loss for the owner and legal accountability for the shepherd, as reflected in Exodus-era liability laws that required proof of predator attacks. David's assignment was not symbolic training, but operational responsibility over assets he did not own, meaning his performance produced consequences without personal reward. This context explains why his early formation emphasized consistency rather than spectacle. Sheep wander unpredictably, forcing constant correction. Grazing cycles require patience measured in seasons, not moments, and extended solitude limits external validation, producing behavioral reinforcement based solely on duty completion. While Saul's army trained in centralized camps using standardized weapons and hierarchical command structures, systems designed for coordinated engagement, David's work required autonomous decision-making, immediate response to threats, and risk without reinforcement, a fundamentally different skill set. His obedience to Jesse, repeatedly emphasized in the narrative, is not portrayed as sentimental loyalty, but as functional submission within a patriarchal economy, where disobedience disrupted household survival. The absence of witnesses in the fields removed reputational incentives, leaving only internal discipline as the stabilizing mechanism, which is why later testimony about David's past relies on actions rather than claims. The narrative progression shows that this phase created a psychological baseline resistant to intimidation, because isolation recalibrates threat assessment. Predators are confronted when avoidance guarantees loss, teaching intervention as default behavior. The consequence of this environment is not emotional resilience, but pattern conditioning. David learned to act without permission, to protect without recognition, and to persist without escalation, all under conditions where failure was immediate and visible while success went unrecorded. This explains why later public confrontation did not represent a behavioral escalation, but a contextual transfer. The battlefield introduced observers, not new risks. The claim that David trained for faithfulness is operationally supported by the structure of his labor. Faithfulness here functions as reliability under uncertainty, measurable through repeated task completion in the absence of reward. By the time David left the fields, he carried an internalized expectation that responsibility precedes acknowledgement, a model reinforced daily through tasks that reset every morning regardless of prior success. The narrative signals that this formation was preparatory by introducing imminent danger immediately afterward, indicating that the skills developed in obscurity were not theoretical but situationally transferable, and that the next escalation would involve the same mechanisms: threat recognition, rapid decision-making, and action under risk, a fundamentally different skill set.
The narrative in 1 Samuel introduces a critical evidentiary detail often treated as metaphor but presented as factual testimony. David tells King Saul that prior to arriving at the Valley of Elah, he killed both a lion and a bear while defending his father's flock, an account offered not as spiritual reflection but as justification for battlefield eligibility, meaning it functioned as a resume under scrutiny. In Iron Age Judah, Asiatic lions and Syrian brown bears were documented predators, apex animals capable of killing livestock and humans, and encounters typically occurred at night or dawn when shepherds were isolated, visibility was low, and response time was limited, making evasion the statistically safer option. David's decision to engage instead of abandon the flock indicates a calculated acceptance of lethal risk driven by asset protection rather than heroism. His description of seizing the predator by the beard and striking it implies close-quarters combat, eliminating distance as a safety buffer and confirming the absence of armor, formations, or assistance, conditions that mirror asymmetric conflict rather than controlled defense. These encounters established a cause and effect framework. Intervention prevented loss, while retreat guaranteed it, reinforcing action as the default response to threat. When David later states, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the bear will deliver me from this Philistine," he is not predicting an outcome, but referencing precedent, using prior incidents as empirical data to support a conclusion, which is why Saul permits him to proceed despite initial resistance. This matters because it demonstrates that David's confidence was conditioned by repeat exposure to danger with survivable outcomes, a known mechanism in behavioral psychology where successful stress navigation reduces perceived threat intensity in future scenarios. The private nature of these incidents is also structurally important. There were no witnesses to exaggerate success, no audience to validate fear, and no authority to intervene, meaning David's responses were internally regulated rather than socially reinforced. Each encounter forced rapid assessment, identify predator, secure animal, neutralize threat, under conditions where hesitation increased mortality, creating a pattern of decisiveness under pressure. By the time David entered the military camp, his nervous system had already adapted to operating under imminent threat, which explains why Goliath's size and weaponry did not register as novel variables, but as familiar escalation. The phrase "fear is temporary" is not theological abstraction in this context, but observable consequence. Fear subsides once action replaces anticipation, while inaction prolongs psychological stress, a dynamic David had repeatedly experienced in isolation. The lethal effectiveness of his faith was not mystical, but functional, operating as a decision-making framework that prioritized intervention over avoidance. This background reframes the battlefield narrative by clarifying that David's readiness did not emerge from inspiration, but from accumulated exposure to risk managed without external validation. However, the text introduces a critical transition immediately after this testimony. David's next challenge does not involve animals or weapons, but human opposition, skepticism, dismissal, and authority-based resistance from those positioned above him, signaling that the upcoming test would target not his courage under threat, but his legitimacy under scrutiny, shifting the conflict from physical survival to social resistance.
When David enters the Israelite encampment described in 1 Samuel 17, the psychological state of the army is already degraded by prolonged exposure to threat without resolution, a condition modern military studies identify as learned helplessness, produced here by 40 days of twice-daily provocation without response, during which Goliath delivered ritualized challenges that combined military intimidation with theological insult by openly defying Israel's God, a tactic designed to undermine both morale and religious identity. David's reaction is diagnostically different. He does not assess Goliath's size, armor mass, or weapon reach, but immediately asks why the challenge is unanswered and what consequences or rewards are attached, revealing that he interprets the situation as a solvable breach of duty rather than an unwinnable contest. This divergence exposes a structural failure within the army, where repeated fear responses have recalibrated norms, turning inaction into perceived prudence and transforming a temporary stalemate into an accepted condition. The social resistance David encounters escalates quickly. His eldest brother Eliab rebukes him, accusing him of arrogance and negligence, a move consistent with sibling hierarchy enforcement in patriarchal cultures, where younger members asserting agency threaten established order. The soldier's dismissal functions as institutional inertia. Trained personnel defer responsibility upward, while leadership hesitates downward, creating a vacuum where initiative is penalized rather than rewarded. When David is brought before Saul, the king's doubt is procedural rather than emotional. Saul cites David's youth and lack of combat record, relying on conventional military criteria that prioritize formal experience over situational competence.
Saul's subsequent offer of royal armor represents an attempt to normalize David within existing structures, but the equipment, helmet, coat of mail, sword, fails functionally because it exceeds David's training parameters. He cannot walk effectively, confirming that unfamiliar tools introduce risk rather than mitigate it. David's refusal is not symbolic rebellion, but a technical decision. Adopting untested equipment under combat conditions would reduce reaction speed, limit mobility, and disrupt motor patterns honed through years of sling use, making the armor a liability rather than protection. By selecting the sling, a ranged weapon with documented lethality capable of delivering kinetic force comparable to a small caliber projectile, David chooses a system he has used repeatedly under stress, aligning weapon choice with practiced skill rather than perceived status. This decision marks the point where the outcome becomes structurally determined because it locks the engagement into parameters favorable to David's experience while bypassing the Philistines' advantage in close combat. Importantly, this moment resolves the internal conflict. David has navigated fear conditioning, social resistance, and institutional doubt without altering his operating framework, demonstrating that external pressure has failed to override internal calibration. The narrative signals finality not through divine declaration, but through convergence. Training, perception, and decision now align, indicating that the remaining step will not introduce new variables, but simply execute an already determined course of action, transitioning the story from preparation to irreversible consequence.
When David steps into the Valley of Elah to face Goliath, the exchange that follows is not psychological warfare, but a formal declaration rooted in covenant theology, recorded in 1 Samuel 17, 45-47, where David states that the conflict will demonstrate divine sovereignty to both armies, a claim functioning as a predictive assertion rather than provocation. This matters because David reframes the engagement's objective, not survival, not national pride, but public verification of Israel's God, which shifts the encounter from personal risk to representative action. Goliath's response, advancing with shield bearer and spear, confirms reliance on close combat dominance, while David's movement toward the brook to select 5 smooth stones introduces a tactical choice grounded in physics and probability. Rounded stones reduce drag, improve sling stability, and increase accuracy at range, a necessity against armored infantry. The sling itself, a centrifugal weapon capable of propelling stones at speeds exceeding 30 meters per second, converts distance into advantage, neutralizing height, armor thickness, and reach, demonstrating that the encounter is resolved by engagement geometry rather than strength. When David releases the stone, the projectile strikes Goliath's forehead, the only exposed area, producing immediate incapacitation, consistent with blunt force trauma outcomes documented in cranial impact injuries, and the Philistine collapses forward, ending the duel in seconds rather than prolonged combat. The aftermath confirms the decisive nature of the act. David uses Goliath's own sword to complete the kill, a symbolic reversal that signals the transfer of power and triggers a cascading military response, with Philistine forces retreating and Israel pursuing, transforming a static standoff into a routed enemy within a single event. The historical consequence is measurable. A conflict immobilized for 40 days is resolved in minutes, illustrating how asymmetrical engagement can collapse entrenched systems when a single variable shifts. The narrative then pivots away from the battlefield outcome to causal interpretation, emphasizing that the decisive factor was not improvisation, but prior surrender of agency. David had already accepted mortality during earlier encounters, which eliminated hesitation at the point of execution. This explains why the act is portrayed as spiritually conclusive before it is physically final. The internal decision preceded the external action, making the moment of release procedural rather than existential. The text's insistence that the battle belongs to the Lord functions as attribution, assigning causality upward rather than inward, thereby preventing the event from being absorbed into personal legacy alone. This framing preserves coherence across the narrative arc. Private obedience leads to public consequence without altering motive structure. The episode concludes not with David's celebration, but with national recognition of a reordered hierarchy, indicating that the victory's primary function is revelatory rather than self-exalting. The unresolved implication remains operational rather than rhetorical. The story does not ask whether giants exist, but whether preparation occurs in contexts where outcomes are unseen, because the decisive engagements of history, personal or collective, are triggered not by sudden courage, but by accumulated alignment between belief, practice, and action, leaving open the question of readiness for conflicts that reveal formation rather than create it.